An NHK helicopter has flown near the stricken Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant for the first time since the accident occurred last March. The no-fly zone over the plant has been reduced to a 3-kilometer radius. NHK shot footage for about 4 kilometers from the plant on Sunday. The Land Ministry decided to scale back the no-fly zone from the original 20-kilometer radius after aerial radioactive readings dropped to a safe level. The 3-kilometer radius took effect on Saturday. The aerial footage shows that the number 3 reactor building has an exposed steel structure distorted by a hydrogen explosion. The yellow cover for the nuclear containment vessel is visible in the number 4 reactor building, where a hydrogen explosion ripped out the walls. A person in a yellow work suit can be seen walking on what was the 5th floor. 10 workers wearing white protective suits are using a crane to cover the seabed near the plant with cement to stop radioactive substances from spreading offshore. The government declared last December that the Fukushima plant had been stabilized, but water leaks have been reported this month. Contaminated water is being stored in about 1,000 steel tanks in the western part of the plant compound.
It is important to provide accurate information because without that data, people would become suspicious and might create rumors.
The ship is to arrive off Fukushima on Saturday and will continue its activities until July 8th.
Millions are going to die from this around the world. No matter what you hear, at least 1 million people died from Chernobyl. Many more are going to die before Fukushima eventually is brought under control. That could be 50 to 100 years. We just don't know. People are being basically sacrificed. 4-year-olds are being given dosimeters or radioactive detection badges and sent off to kindergarten. This is criminal. It should not be allowed to happen. But it is. And we'll see what the Japanese people are made of in terms of how they stand up to this and demand and force their government to stop the crap. These plants, all 55 of them, have to be shut down. Tim, go ahead.
Well, we had an earthquake today in that region.
6.7.
Which probably caused damage to reactors, which we're not being told about, because we know now that the Japanese government are obfuscating, mendacious, and disinformative. In plain American, it means they're lying bastards. I think we'll find that Tim Rifat's analysis that it's equal in the amount of fallout to a nuclear war, World War III, will prove correct because there was so much material at the site and it was so old, and which the older the material, the older the fuel rods, the more plutonium they've got, and it's the plutonium that's the really nasty stuff. Now, looking at the unintended consequences, the most dangerous aspect of a World War III version of fallout, that's 20 to 100,000 nuclear weapons worth of fallout, which I think will be released by the Japanese reactors, not just the Fukushima one, but some of the others which they're not even talking about, and other aftershocks which will damage other reactors. This will be more than enough to poison the most vulnerable members of the human species, which are the developing embryos in all future generations. And the good thing about radioactivity is that it's cumulative, so the mutation and damage to offspring which will occur in women who are having breeding children at the moment will be far worse in the children that these mutants breed, and then their offspring will be even more damaged, because radiation, according to research, seems to cause more and more damage in future generations. There was an article in New Scientist all about it. So this will mean that these the monobreeders, for example, the Chinese, will have problems, but they've got such a huge population that an increase in genetic damage, mutation of the children, for example, after Chernobyl, the hot spot where Chernobyl left the largest amount of radiation was southern Belarus, which is to the north of the Ukraine where the Chernobyl reactor was. And there we had several thousand badly damaged children born, most of them getting cancer in their teens. And what we'll see from this massive amount of fallout is an increase in childhood cancers and an increase in deformed babies. And luckily, Westerners only have 1 or 2 children, so the damage will be magnified by the small number of offspring Westerners have. But luckily, the Africans and the Hispanics have huge families. In the West, they put them into special hospitals and look after them, which is a great drain on the West and will exacerbate the economic downfall of the West, having millions, if not tens of millions, if not a significant, maybe 30-40% of babies all deformed in one way or another. This will have a massive knock-on effect on the West, where they look after these degenerates. In the West, they're looked after, cosseted, and even allowed to breed. So it's a wonderful route to destroy the West via genetic damage to their offspring. And the end result of this will be, of course, that the majority of healthy people are born to Africans and Hispanics who have huge families. So inevitably what you're going to do is have a change of demographics. The West their children will be poisoned and deformed, and the Africans and Hispanics will have healthy children simply because they breed so many, and the healthy ones, of course, can then migrate to the West and start to occupy the West in large numbers, much larger numbers than we have now, thanks to the massive fallout of Chernobyl. Already we've got a massive migration of sub-Saharan blacks moving into Europe. 50 million are coming in with the EU, are actively moving them in.
That's an incredible number, 50 million. The hard science of radiation and radioactivity is simply indisputable. You cannot discount it if you know about it. Of course, unfortunately, most of the people don't know about it. March 15th, 16th, 17th, therein, the jet stream, absolutely, irrevocably proven now, carried radioactivity to the United States and to Europe in the 3, 4, 5 days after the earthquake and tsunami. Go ahead, Tim.
Well, the main problem are the fuel fleas, which of course embed in the lungs and in the gastrointestinal system. Now, they're releasing radiation to give you lung cancer and stomach and colon cancer, and then they can migrate into the bones to give you bone cancer. But that, of course, is a pretty long-term thing. You're not going to die of cancer instantly from the massive release and continual release. The continual release of radioactivity hasn't stopped. These reactors are continually releasing it, and the problem was there was so many fuel rods, spent fuel rods on the site as well. A lot of these are burning and have been nanoparticleized, and the water, which they're trying to cool the China syndrome reactor cores, which are burning through the bottom of the buildings into the groundwater. Then they'll start to burn because the plutonium reacts explosively with air and water, and you'll get a giant explosion, or you can do. What I'm talking about tonight is that a lot of people in the West are going to get cancer. It's going to severely damage the long-term health of Westerners, especially Americans who breathe in a lot of fuel fleas. As for the Japanese, they are well and truly foobarred, but the radiation has the most dramatic effect on the embryo, which is a tiny clump of cells. And as you can imagine, you don't need much radiation zapping through that embryo and the blastocyst, which is the clump of cells before the embryo, in order to cause irrevocable damage in the blastocyst, which then turns into a damaged embryo, and the damaged embryo then grows into one of these mutants. So, of course, the main effect of the fuel fleas, which are now covering the northern hemisphere, is not on the health of old fogies like myself, who, of course, probably will outlive the radiation in terms that we haven't got a long lifespan, and by the time we get massive lung cancers or colon cancers, etc., we'll be in our dotage. It's the damage it causes to these tiny clumps of cells, which is when the sperm and the egg come together to form, they fertilize egg, and the egg starts dividing and it's turned into something called a blastocyst. This is only a tiny clump of cells. These things are going zapping through the embryo, going bing, 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 damaging the DNA in the blastocyst, which then causes these deformed embryos. So if you only have one or two children like the Westerners, and you look after these damaged children, for example, all the damaged children of the West are sacrosanct. You can't touch them. They've got to be allowed to grow and have children and do whatever they like, and the state has to look after them. You can see the massive damage to the West caused not by the cancers and deaths in the adults, but that all future generations are going to get more and more damaged. And the West system of nanny state, where they look after the genetically damaged, is such that it is a force multiplier, in that if, for example, you have 10% of the population as these Fukushima mutants, then of course that will collapse the health system of America and Britain, because you simply can't afford it. And this is the elephant in the middle of the room. If enough radiation is released from Fukushima, then that's the end.
Hello, YouTubers. It is 1/22/2016. This talk that I'm fixing to record has a Creative Commons where it can be shared, so here we go.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. A large number of highly radioactive isotopes released by the destruction of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant grossly contaminated the Japanese mainland. Most of these radionuclides had short half-lives, which meant they would essentially disappear in a matter of days or months. For many of those who were exposed to them, there will be major health consequences. However, there are some radioactive elements that will not rapidly disappear, and it is these long-lived radionuclides that will remain to negatively affect the health of all complex life forms that are exposed to them. Chief among them is cesium-137, which has taken on special significance because it's proven to be the most abundant of the long-lived radionuclides that has remained in the environment following the nuclear disasters at Chernobyl and Fukushima. It has a 30-year radioactive half-life, which is why it persists in the environment. Scientists now believe that it will be 180 to 320 years before the cesium-137 around the destroyed Chernobyl reactor actually disappears from the environment. Cesium is water-soluble and quickly makes its way into soils and waters. It is the same atomic family as potassium, and it mimics it, acting as a macronutrient. It quickly becomes ubiquitous in contaminated ecosystems. It is distributed by the catastrophic accidents at nuclear power plants because large quantities of volatile radioactive cesium build up inside the fuel rods of nuclear reactors. Thus, any accident at a nuclear reactor that causes the fuel rods to rupture, melt, or burn will cause the release of radioactive cesium gas. Long-lived radionuclides, such as cesium-137, are something new to us as a species. They did not exist on Earth in any appreciable quantities during the entire evolution of complex life. Although they are invisible to our senses, they are millions of times more poisonous than most of the common poisons we are familiar with. They cause cancer, leukemia, genetic mutations, birth defects, malformations, and abortions at concentrations almost below human recognition and comprehension. They are lethal at the atomic or molecular level. They emit radiation, invisible forms of matter and energy that we might compare to fire, because radiation burns and destroys human tissue. But unlike the fire of fossil fuels, the nuclear fire that issues forth from radioactive elements cannot be extinguished. It is not a fire that can be scattered or suffocated, because it burns at the atomic level. It comes from the disintegration of single atoms. Thus, radioactivity is a term which indicates how many radioactive atoms are disintegrating in a time period. We measure the intensity of radioactivity by the rate of disintegrations and the energy they produce. 1 becquerel is equal to 1 atomic disintegration per second. 1 curie is defined as that amount of any radioactive material that will decay at a rate of 37 billion disintegrations per second. So 1 curie equals 37 billion becquerels. Sometimes these man-made radionuclides are compared to naturally occurring radionuclides, such as potassium-40, which is always found in bananas and other fruits. However, this is a false comparison, since naturally occurring radioactive elements are very weakly radioactive. In the charts from the labs that are in green up there, the radioactivity is described as a specific activity. Note that potassium-40 has a specific activity of 71 10-millionths of a curie per gram. Compare that to the 88 curies per gram for cesium-137. It's like comparing a stick of dynamite to an atomic bomb. Highly radioactive fission products such as cesium-137 and strontium-90 emit 10 to 20 million times more radiation per unit volume than does potassium-40. So which one of these would you rather have in your bananas? It is in fact the amount of cesium-137 deposited per square kilometer of land that defines the degree to which an area is classified as being too radioactive to work or live. One may get an idea of the extreme toxicity of cesium-137 by considering how little of it is required to make a large area of land uninhabitable. The lands that were grossly contaminated by the destruction of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant are classified by the number of curies of radiation per square kilometer. There were 3,840 square miles of land contaminated with 15 to 40 curies of radiation per square kilometer. These lands are considered strict radiation dose control zones. The 1,100 square mile uninhabitable exclusion zone that surrounds a destroyed Chernobyl reactor has greater than 40 curies of radioactivity per square kilometer. For those more familiar with square miles, that would be 104 curies per square mile. Consider again that 1 gram of cesium-137 has 88 curies of radioactivity. Thus, as little as 1/3 of a gram of cesium-137 made into microparticles, distributed as a smoke or gas over an area of 1 square kilometer will make that square kilometer uninhabitable. Less than 2 grams of cesium-137, a piece smaller than an American dime, if made into microparticles and evenly distributed over as a radioactive gas over an area of 1 square mile, will turn that square mile into an uninhabitable radioactive exclusion zone. Central Park in New York City can be made uninhabitable by 2 grams of microparticles of cesium-137. Hard to believe, isn't it? Remember, these nuclear poisons are lethal at the atomic level. There are as many atoms in 1 gram of cesium-137 as there are grains of sand on all the beaches of the world. That's 10 to 21 atoms, 10 to the 21st power. 1,480 trillion of them, which is 10 to the 12th power, are disintegrating every second, releasing invisible nuclear energy. So this works out to about 1.5 million disintegrations per square meter. I included an extra slide just to note the immense inventories of cesium-137, 150 million curies that are located in the nearby spent fuel pool at Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant, which is about 40 miles from here by road, and less than that as the radioactive cloud flies. Many of the 104 U.S. commercial nuclear reactors and power plants have more than 100 million curies of cesium-137 in their spent fuel pools. This is many times more than the spent pools at Fukushima. So now that we have some idea of the extreme toxicity of cesium-137, let's look at the extent of the contamination of the Japanese mainland. It's now known that the reactors 1, 2, and 3 at Fukushima Daiichi all melted down and melted through the seal reactor vessels within a few days following the earthquake and tsunami of March 11, 2011. This was not made public by either TEPCO or the Japanese government for 2 months. The greatest amounts of highly radioactive gases were released shortly after the meltdowns, and 80% of this gas released by the actors believed to have traveled away from Japan over the Pacific. However, the remaining 20% was dispersed over the Japanese mainland. On March 11th, the U.S. National Nuclear Security Administration offered the use of its NA-42 aerial measuring system to the Japanese and U.S. governments. The National Atmospheric Release Advisory Center of the Lawrence Livermore Lab stood up to provide atmospheric modeling projections. The next 2 slides were produced by Lawrence Livermore, were presumably given to the Japanese government. On March 14th, the easterly winds which had been blowing the highly radioactive gases and aerosols coming from Fukushima out to sea shifted and pushed the radioactive plume back over the Japanese mainland. You can see the progression. The red indicates the radioactive plume. Note that the images indicate that the plume first went south over Tokyo, and then reversed and went north as the wind changed. All the areas where the radioactive gases passed were contaminated. However, the heaviest contamination occurred where rainfall, where it rained out. And this accounts for the patchy deposition of the radioactive fallout. 8 months after the disaster, the Japanese Science Ministry released this map. That's the one with the, let's see, it would be on your right, which shows that 11,580 square miles, which is 30,000 square kilometers, which represents 13% of the Japanese mainland, have been contaminated with long-lived radioactive cesium. Note that the official map does not note any cesium-137 contamination in the Tokyo metropolitan area, unlike an unofficial survey done about the same time by Professor Yukio Hayakawa of Gunma University. Given the fact that the Japanese government and TEPCO denied for 2 months that any meltdowns that had occurred at Fukushima, one must look at all official data with a healthy degree of skepticism. 4,500 square miles, or earlier today we heard 7,700 square miles, which is an area larger than the size of Connecticut, was found to have radiation levels that exceeded Japan's previously allowable exposure rate of 1 millisievert per year. Rather than evacuate this area, Japan chose to raise its acceptable radiation exposure rate by 20 times, from 1 millisievert to 20 millisieverts per year. However, approximately 300 square miles adjacent to the destroyed Fukushima reactors were so contaminated they were declared uninhabitable. 159,000 Japanese were evicted from this radioactive exclusion zone, lost their homes, property, and businesses, and most have received only a small compensation to cover the costs of their living as evacuees. Note here that the criteria used for evacuation is the millisievert. It's not a measured quantity of radiation per unit area that I've described, such as the Curie or Becquerel. Rather, the sievert is a calculated quantity. It's calculated to represent the biological effects of ionizing radiation. In other words, the millisievert is a derived number based on the mathematical models which are used to convert the absorbed dose to effective dose. So what is the increased health risk to Japanese based upon their exposure to 20 millisieverts per year? Let's examine the figures constructed on the basis of data published by the National Academy of Sciences. It was provided to me by Ian Gard. The vertical y-axis is calibrated to the number of cancer cases per 100,000 age peers. The horizontal x-axis depicts the age of the population beginning at 0 years and moving towards old age. Examine the allegedly safe dose of 20 millisieverts per year. As a result of this exposure, there will be about 1,000 additional cases of cancer in female infants and 500 cases of cancer in infant boys per 100,000 in their age groups. There will be an additional 100 cases of cancer in 30-year-old males in their age groups. Now, notice that children, especially girls, are at most risk from radiation-induced cancer. In fact, female infant has 7 times greater risk, and a 5-year-old girl has 5 times greater risk of getting a radiation-induced cancer than does a 30-year-old man. I want to note here that there's a great deal of controversy in regards to the accuracy of the methods used to arrive at the millisievert measurement, especially in regard to an accurate determination of the biological effects of an external versus internal exposure to ionizing radiation. That is, the effects of an exposure to a source of ionizing radiation that is external to the body versus an exposure that comes from the ingestion of radionuclides that provide a chronic, long-term internal exposure to living cells, which are adjacent to the radioactive atoms or particles. In the land surrounding Chernobyl and Fukushima, the primary route of internal exposure is through the ingestion of foodstuffs contaminated with cesium-137, which tends to bioaccumulate in plants and animals. What this means is that cesium-137 cannot be excreted faster than it's being ingested. Thus it accumulates and increases in its concentration in the plant or animal that is routinely ingesting it. Cesium-137 also tends to biomagnify as it moves up the food chain. This means it becomes progressively more concentrated in predator species. We've seen this before with other industrial toxins such as DDT, which can magnify its concentration millions of times from the bottom to the top of a food chain. Consequently, all of the foodstuffs in a contaminated region tend to contain cesium-137. Those naturally rich in potassium, such as mushrooms and berries, tend to have very high concentrations. Dairy products and meats also tend to have higher concentrations. The International Commission on Radiological Protection, the ICRP, which sets radiation safety standards, recognizes that cesium-137 bioaccumulates in humans. This ICRP figure compares a single ingestion of 1,000 becquerels of cesium-137, a one-time exposure,